Okay, so how do we compute this present value figure? So I'll run you through a few simple examples to try to give you the intuition. Okay, so suppose you have the following choice. This is sort of a simpler choice than the earlier one. Suppose I give you the choice between $100 today and $110 exactly 1 year from now. Let's assume further that the interest rate is 10%, just to make the numbers easy. Okay. Now, if the interest rate is 10%, then these two situations are equivalent to each other because you can take that $100 you received today, invest it at a 10% rate, and get $110 a year from now. Okay. So either way, you're getting $110 a year in the future. Therefore, we would say that the present value of $110 1 year from now is equal to $100. Okay, because $100 invested at a 10% rate would be equal to $110 in 1 year. Okay, so it's sort of like, it's almost like building a time machine and taking these sums of money and sort of dragging them back into today's terms, right? So we know that a certain amount of money being paid to you in the future is worth less than if that same amount of money was paid to you today. But by how much less? Well, we need to take that amount of money in the future and sort of drag it back into today's terms. And the way we do that is by calculating sort of the value today that would be equivalent to that value a certain amount of time in the future, taking into account the interest rate. Okay, so here's another example. Okay, suppose that you either get paid $100 today or $121 2 years from now. Well, as it turns out, both of these situations are equivalent because if you take $100 today and invest that money for 2 years in a row, well, let's see. So you have $100 today. After 1 year, you're going to have $110. Take that amount of money, reinvest it at a 10% interest rate, and at the end of 2 years, you're going to have $121. Okay, so again, so these two things are equivalent, getting $100 today or getting $121 2 years from now. So we would say that the present value of $121 2 years from now is equal to $100. Okay, so here's the formula in general to compute it. Okay, so if you're receiving a certain amount of money, YT, a certain amount of periods T in the future, then the present value of that is equal to that amount of money divided by this term. This term I'm going to call the interest rate factor. Okay, this 1 plus r raised to the power t, where t is the number of years in the future that you expect to be getting paid. Okay, so for example, in the case of that I just mentioned, okay, what's the present value of, let's say, $110? We would take a year from now, we would take the $110 and divide by 1 plus the interest rate, which is 0.1 in this case, 10%, 0.1. So it would be 1 plus 0.1 raised to the power t, and in this case, you're being paid a year from now, so t would be 1. So it would be 110 divided by 1.1, which of course is 100. Okay, now there's no point, okay, in doing this calculation sort of manually. I mean, I could have you, compute this number for like a certain number of years in the future. Doing it manually is just a bunch of work on your calculator. Okay, but what I do want you to learn is how to use this document right here. Okay, so this is a present value calculator that I've set up for you. Okay, and this can handle basically any sort of payment over time. And so I'm going to show you how to use this calculator, and then I want you to practice using it on your homework. Okay. So how does this calculator work? So you can see it's pretty straightforward. Okay. I have years and a place for you to fill out income going down. And then notice in the middle here, in column C, I have the interest rate factor. Okay, and this interest rate factor is simply this term that I showed you before, 1 plus the interest rate raised to the power t, where t is the amount of time in years. Okay, and obviously if I change it, I can go over here and I can change the interest rate, and this interest rate factor is going to change. So for example, if I if I double the interest rate, okay, to 0.2, okay, then this interest rate factor is going to change. Okay. Okay, so how does this work? So, okay, let's just recap the examples that we saw earlier, right? So suppose you're going to get paid $110 1 year in the future. So how would I find the present value to that? So what I would do is I would go over here to the 1 year and I would type in an income of 110. Okay, and you can see that, okay, so the answer to that question, I ignore this running total for a second. We're going to use that later. Okay, let me actually just hide that for now. Okay, so the present value of $110 being paid to you 1 year in the future, as you can see, is $100. Okay, now suppose I was going to be paid $121 2 years from now. You can see once again that that amount of money is $100. Okay, so so let's do sort of a more extreme example. All right. So what's the present value of being paid $1 million 100 years in the future, assuming a 5% interest rate? And you go to yourself, well, in 100 years, maybe I'll be dead. Okay, let's just assume that that's not a concern. Okay, assume that you're going to live to be able to see the money. Okay, what's the present value of $1 million paid to you 100 years in the future, assuming a 5% interest rate? Okay, well, how would I answer this question? I would go over to my present value calculator. I would change the interest rate to 5%, so 0.05. Okay, and then I would simply dial in $1 million at this 100 years in the future mark. So let me type in $1 million. Okay, so that's 6 zeros. And you can see that the present value of $1 million 100 years in the future is only like $7,000, a little bit over $7,600 today. What that means is if you were to receive $7,604 today and you invested that money for 100 years, then you would get $1 million in 100 years. Okay? Okay, so I hope that calculation makes sense to everybody. All right? We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next video.